This is Dan, and this is the Napkin Academy. Our lesson now is the blank ways we see. And based on some of the things we've talked about already, how many ways do you think they might be? There are, in fact, 6. The 6 ways that we see. In a previous lesson, we talked about the 6 types of problems that we face. Now we're going to talk about the 6 types of pictures that our mind sees. And what we're going to see is that they are actually 2 sides of the same coin. On the tail side, we had the 6 coordinate system of the types of 6 problems that we have. Who's and what's, how much is, etc. On the head side, the other side of the coin, the side we're going to look at now, we're going to find that there are a corresponding set of 6 ways that we see the world coming in. And as I say, they do align in a really interesting way. To understand what this is all about, we do have to spend a couple of moments talking about the neurobiology of vision, just to get kind of a groundwork. So let's do a little schematic diagram of our brain. So this is the part of our brain called the cortex or the neocortex. Just to give some context, here's our eyeball over here, looking out, little eyelashes. We're looking this way. Optic nerve connects. Now at the back of the cortex is something called the occipital, lobe. And interestingly, buried inside is something that looks a little bit like this, which is called the limbic brain. And then underneath that is a very, very ancient part of our brain called the brainstem, or the reptilian brain. Now, this is important only in understanding how we see the world, because what happens from a purely biomechanical sort of a process is there's a picture out here. And let's say there's some more elements to that picture. There's enough things for us to really kind of look at for a moment. What happens is this image in the form of electrical signals comes into our eye and is processed very quickly on our retina into another form of electrical signals that gets sent off through our optic nerve into our brain. But now here is where things get pretty interesting. Back here in the occipital lobe is a part of the brain called the visual cortex. Now it might seem to make sense to say that, oh, I guess all of the visual signal gets pumped back into the visual cortex, it gets processed, and we see the world. But of course it is nowhere near that simple. In fact, what we're going to find is that about 10% of the visual signal, before it even goes really into any sort of processing, gets shunted off into our reptilian brain. We call that the old where pathway. We're going to talk about these pathways again in a moment and see how they make some sense. But what it means is that about 10% of the visual signal gets pushed into a very old part of our brain. Another big part of the signal does go back here into the visual cortex. And part of that is called the new where visual pathway. And you'd think that might be it, but no, because another part of the signal gets pushed into a completely different part of the brain that really has very little to do with the visual cortex, and that is called the what pathway. But we're still not done, because another part gets shunted off over here, and that is called the how pathway. Now, you may see an interesting pattern emerging, because if you remember what our 6-dimensional coordinate system for asking about different types of problems was labeled, one was called who and what, one was called how much, one was called where, one was called when, one was called how, and the last one was called why. Now look at this kind of cool correspondence. It turns out that the pathways by which we see have almost the same names. There is a where pathway the visual part of our mind that understands the location of items. There is a what pathway, the part of our visual system and mind that understands the things we're looking at. There is a how pathway, the part of our visual system that puts things together and deduces cause and effect based on what we've been able to see. The point I want to make is there's a direct correspondence between the physical, biophysical operations of vision and this 6x6 coordinate system. Now, part of this is theoretical and part of this is scientifically proven, if you will. We know for a fact that at least 4 of these pathways have been identified and we know where they are. I think it's fair to say that the other 2 remain somewhat theoretical. But what we're going to find is interesting is that we can still use them to make a very rational, repeatable, sustainable model for how do we actually see the world in discrete ways. Now, that's enough theory. Let's put this into some real seeing practice. So what we're going to do on the next set of images, there are going to be 4 of them. I'm going to be very quiet because all I want you to do is look at the next set of images for a few moments and just see if you can see that there are some things in these images. This is image A, and I hope that you're seeing that there are some things in this image. I'm now going to go on to image B, and don't worry, we're going to go back and forth a few times. I don't want anyone to get stressed out. This isn't a test. This is just an interesting exercise. We're going now from A to B. I'd like you to be looking for things that were different from what we saw in A. Now to help out, we're going to go back to A for a moment. Back to A. Looking for things that are different between this picture and back to B now. We're looking at B again. And we're going to do that one more time. Back to A and back to B. And this time, I want you to think about the question as we look at A. How much time do you think has passed between this picture A and this picture B? How much time do you think might have passed? I think that for most of us, we're going to agree that some number of seconds has passed. Not minutes, not hours, some number of seconds has passed. Now, let's continue. We're going to go on to the next picture in the sequence. This is now picture C. I hope you're seeing that something new has happened. And now we're going to go on to the last picture. This is picture D. And I hope you can see that something else has happened. We're going to do that from C to D one more time with the same question in mind. As we go back to picture C for a moment, back to C, as we're going to shift back to D, I want you to ask the same question. How much time has passed between C and D? I'm hoping that most of us would agree that probably some number of hours have passed. So from A to B, some number of seconds passed. From C to D, some number of hours passed. Well, isn't that kind of remarkable that we were able to see that, given how little is actually in these pictures? Let's go back to C for a moment and just do a quick analysis of what's in these pictures. So what is in these pictures? Well, there are some stick figures. A little girl here, stick figure boat over here, if you can make it out, bridge over here. There's some black and white drawing. And there's a tiny bit of gray. Let's think about what there is not in these pictures. There are no 3D effects. There is almost no color. There's no color at all. There's no shadows. In other words, there is none of the fancy eye candy that we get so used to using when we're creating PowerPoints, when we're trying to make our images more compelling or our slides more compelling. We don't need it. Look at what just happened as we look at those 4 pictures. Believe it or not, what just happened as we looked at those 4 pictures was we saw our entire visual processing system kick into gear. We just witnessed a little scale model of how we see the world in its simplest form. So what happened is we did not see those pictures all at once. We saw those 4 pictures, yes, in sequence, but even as we looked at each individual picture, some really powerful things happened in our visual system. And what actually turns out is that we saw those pictures in 6 ways. And this is a process that goes both in serial, we see a part, then we see another part, then we see another part, and in parallel. We see many of these different work streams at the same time. So what happened? Number 1, we saw the objects, the whos and the whats in the pictures. Number 2, we saw number. How much? How many birds were there? How many little girls were there? How many people were there? How many dogs were there? Number 3 is we actually saw where they were in relation to each other. We saw where. Number 4, we saw as we went from one image, from A to B to C to D, we saw things change. We saw the dog start here, and then the dog move over here, and then the birds move over here. We actually saw when. We saw time. And that's exactly how we knew how much time had passed between the various drawings, even though no actual time had passed between them in a measurable way. And we didn't comment at the time. We didn't have a stopwatch running, but we still knew when things were happening. 5th, we added all of those things together. We saw some little girl with some little dog chase some little birds over some period of time, and we deduced something. We actually saw cause and effect. We saw how the picture was unfolding. And when it was all done, we added up all of these things. They went through all 5 of those steps: who and what, how much, where, when, how. They all came together to give us the final deduction, which was why. The 6th way that we see the world, the big answer, why did all of this just happen the way it did? So that's exactly what happened in our visual processing system. To summarize, why is this important? This is going to become critically important in the next couple of lessons, because we're going to see now the 6 ways we see are going to correspond exactly to 6 simple pictures we can draw to show anything. And the way I like to sort of summarize this is a little schematic diagram. We can count this all on one hand. So if we wanted to say, okay, how do we see the world? Well, we see it who and what. It's finger number 1. Finger number 2, we see number, we see how much. Finger number 3, we see where, we see location. Finger number 4, we see when, we see time. Finger number 5, we see all of those put together, and we see how. And now, if we were to put all of those together and make a single fist that puts together all 5 of those, we get way of seeing number 6, why, what our mind really wants to see.